An Appreciation by Anna Quindlen. The most memorable books from our childhoods are those that make us feel less alone, convince us that our own foibles and quirks are both as individual as a fingerprint and as universal as an open hand. That's why I still have the copy of A Wrinkle in Time that was given to me when I was 12 years old. It long ago lost its dust jacket, the fabric binding it's loose and water-stained, and the soft and loopy signature on its inside cover bears little resemblance to the way I sign my name today. The girl who first owned it has grown up and changed, but the book she loved, though battered, is still magical. Its heroine is someone who feels very much alone indeed. Meg Murray has braces, glasses, and flyaway hair. She can't seem to get anything right in school, where everyone thinks she is strange and stupid, and she runs up against some real nastiness at a young age. In the form of all those snide looks and comments about her father, a scientist who seems to have mysteriously vanished, or town gossip has it, run off with another woman. But Meg doesn't know real evil until she sets out on a journey to find her father and bring him home, along with her little brother, Charles Wallace, and a boy named Calvin. As they transcend time, space, and the limitations of their own minds, they get help from individuals of great goodness. Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Witch, Mrs. Who, the happy medium, and Aunt Best, not Beast. But the climax of their journey is a showdown with it, the cold and calculating, disembodied intelligence that has cast a black shadow over the universe in its quest to make everyone behave and believe the same. If that sounds like science fiction, it's because that's one way to describe the story, or perhaps you could call it the fiction of science. The action of the book, the search for Meg and Charles Wallace's missing father, relies on something called a tesseract, which is a way to travel through time and space using a fifth dimension. Although there's even a little illustration to make it easier to visualize, I still am not certain I do. Of course, Meg, who is so bright she can do square roots in her head, doesn't entirely understand it either. For just a moment I got it, she says. I can't possibly explain it now, but for a second I saw it. The truth is, I'm not a fan of science fiction, and my math and physics gene has already been weak. But there's plenty in the book for those of us predisposed toward the humanities as well. Mrs. Who remedies her language defect by using the words of others to explain herself, quotes Dante, Euripides, and Cervantes, to name just a few. When Meg is trying to keep it from invading her brain, she realizes the multiplication tables are too rote to do the trick and instead shouts out the opening of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It retorts that that's the point, everybody exactly alike. Meg replies triumphantly, no, like and equal are not the same thing at all. Madeline L'Engle published Wrinkle in 1962 after it was rejected by dozens of publishers, and her description of the tyranny of conformity clearly reflects that time. The identical houses outside with identical children bounce balls and jump rope in mindless unison evoke the fears so many Americans had of communist regimes that enshrine the interests of state-mandated order over the rights of the individual. Why do you think we have wars at home? Charles Wallace asks his sister, channeling the mind of it. Why do you think people get confused and unhappy? Because they all live their own separate individual lives. He tells Meg she already knows from her own everyday battles. Differences create problems. But while Ellinghamine's story may have originally been inspired by the gray sameness of those communist countries, it still feels completely contemporary today, except maybe for Meg's desire for a typewriter to get around her dreadful penmanship. The Murray home is fractured by Mr. Murray's mysterious absence and Meg's mother sleeping alone in the great double bed. Calvin may look like a golden boy, but his family barely notices he's alive. Even Mr. Timeless is the sense Meg has of herself as someone who doesn't fit in, who does everything wrong. Conformity knows no time or place. It is a struggle all of us face, to be ourselves despite the overwhelming pressure to be like everyone else. Perhaps one of the most compelling and moving descriptions of that internal battle comes near the end of the book, when Mrs. Whatsit tells children that life with its rules, its obligations, and its freedoms is like a sonnet. You're given the form, but you have to write the sonnet yourself. What you say is completely up to you. On its surface, this is a book about three children who fight an evil force threatening their planet, but it is really about a more primal battle of human beings face to respect, defend, and love themselves. when Meg pulls the ultimate weapon from her emotional arsenal to fight for her little brother and for good, it is a great moment. Not just for her, but for every reader who has ever felt overlooked, confused, alone. It has been more than 4 decades since I first read A Wrinkle in Time. If I could test her, perhaps in some different time and place, I would find a Meg Murray just my age, a grown woman with an astonishing brain, a good heart, and a unique perspective on how our differences are what makes life worth living. Oh, how I would love to meet her. So that was the introduction to this book. Hello everyone, I'm Jasmine. Welcome to my world. And today, I want to do something a lot like what I did last week. Except it's a little twist because I started off reading from it and not introducing myself. So if you're new, please subscribe and like and comment, and before all you techno geeks get on there into that keyboard and start going like, oh, you need a better camera, oh, you're so laggy, oh, blah blah blah. Be quiet. It adds character, okay? Just enjoy it. And that's what I like to live my life like. Oh, just enjoy it. Who cares? It's not hurting anyone. And so that is why I'm doing with my crummy computer camera. But you can still hear me, so that's good, and you can still see me. I'm going to do a review on A Wrinkle in Time. Last week I did a review on this book. And if you haven't watched that video, you totally should. It's a great book. And a lot like Fever, I've read Wrinkle in Time many times in my childhood. It is one of my favorites. I was so excited when the movie came out, but so disappointed. If you don't know, if you've watched the movie but not read the book, you need to read the book. The movie it's nothing like the book, okay? They take an entire character out of the movie. What's the character? The character is God. Yes, God is a character in this book. There's a lot of references to God. There's a little bit of praying. There's things that the characters in this book do that suggest it's a Christian book. And Hollywood, they took a Christian book and knocked the Christian right out of it. I don't think the original author would approve of the movie. Just saying. Anyway. Yeah. This book is better than the movie. The movie is trash. The movie is not A Wrinkle in Time. It's a wrinkle in a sheet, I guess. Anyway. You can't take a character away. What's up, dudes? Out of that. So, A Wrinkle in Time, I've read this book so many times when I was younger. There's so many puns I could do. I've read it a lot. And I really do suggest this book. And I want to read the first chapter, like I did with Fever, and talk a little bit about it with my thoughts when it comes to this book. I haven't read, if you were to look at the spine of Fever and you could see all the creases, you look at the pages, you could see how easy it is for it all to open. And then you were to look at The Wrinkle in Time and see how, it's easy to open, but it doesn't just stay open as well as Fever does. I've read Fever a lot more than I've read Wrinkle in Time. So my memory on this book is not like my memory on this book. This book, my memory is solid for the most part. This book, I remember the events, I remember the characters, just not a whole lot. And something I found from last week is there was quite a bit of foreshadowing in the first chapter of Fever. And so I want to see how much foreshadowing there is in the first chapter of A Wrinkle in Time. So, let's get to it, and then we'll talk about it. Alright. So first things first, the book has a lot of character, which I really enjoy. If you remember in Fever, there were quotes in the beginning of the chapters. I love it when authors add some character to their books. It's like the book itself is a character and not just the characters in the book. And so you can see the font of the first chapter, the title of it. It's Mrs. Whatsit. Another great character. I love the witches in this book. They're interesting. They really help the children make sure they don't die. They're like the irresponsible adults in the adventure with more responsibility than they're given credit for. Let's get to it. It was a dark and stormy night. In her attic bedroom, Margaret Murray, wrapped in an old patchwork quilt, sat on the foot of her bed and watched the trees tossing in the frenzied lashing of the wind. Behind the trees, clouds scudded frantically across the sky. Every few moments the moon ripped through them, creating wreath-like shadows that raced along the ground. The house shook. Wrapped in her quilt, Meg shook. She wasn't usually afraid of weather. It's not just the weather, she thought. It's the weather on top of everything else. On top of me. On top of Meg Murray doing everything wrong. School was all wrong. She'd been dropped down to the lowest section in her grade. That morning, one of her teachers had said crossly, "Really, Meg, I don't understand how a child with parents as brilliant as yours can be such a poor student. If you don't manage to do a little better, you'll have to stay back next year." During lunch, she'd roughhoused a little to try to make herself feel better, and one of the girls said scornfully, "After all, Meg, we aren't grammar school kids anymore. Why do you always act like such a baby?" And on the way home from school, walking up the road with her arms full of books, one of the boys had said something about her dumb baby brother. At this, she'd thrown the books on the side of the road and tackled him with every ounce of strength she had, and arrived home with her blouse torn and a big bruise under one eye. Sandy and Denny's, her 10-year-old twin brothers, who got home from school an hour earlier than she did, were disgusted. "Let us do the fighting when it's necessary," they told her. "A delinquent, that's what I am," she thought grimly. "That's what they'll be saying next. Not mother, but them, everybody else. I wish father." Something I'd like to point out. So you can't see it because I'm reading it. But in a sentence, the first letter of the first word is supposed to be capitalized. The only phone is deciding to get my attention. Okay. The only exception for capitalizing a word in a sentence is if it's a proper noun, like someone's name, just something like that. And so in this paragraph right here, a delinquent, that's what I am, she thought grimly. That's what they'll be saying next. Not mother, but them, everybody else. I wish father. So it makes sense that with there being not mother, so that right there, that's a sentence. Not is capitalized because it's the first word in the sentence. And mother is capitalized because it's a proper noun. She's referring to another character as mother, calling her mother as if that's her name. But then the next sentence is but them. And in them is capitalized, even though it's the second letter of the sentence. Usually you wouldn't capitalize that, but here the author is referencing that Meg is thinking of other people. She's calling other people them. It's a proper noun. It's a character, them. And everybody else. Everybody is capitalized because it's the first word in a sentence, but else is also capitalized and it's the second word. Once again, else, the author is using else as a proper noun. Meg is referencing them and else as the same person, just to really, the author is really trying to capture something for the reader, trying to send a message that how Meg is feeling and all that. And then father, I wish father. Father is, another proper noun, so it makes sense. But I thought it was cool that the author capitalized them and else. And I'm saying the author because I'm having a hard time pronouncing the last name. I'll just say Madeline. L'Engle. Madeline. The author's name is Madeline. I usually go by the last name. Like with Fever, I kept referring to the author as Anderson, but no. Madeline. Continue. But it was still not possible to think about her father without the danger of tears. Only her mother could talk about him in a natural way, saying, "When your father gets back." Gets back from where? Another thing I'd like to think about is, so I'm not sure if you can actually see it, but the sentence, you see these lines here? What's happening is the author is using a separate paragraph to interrupt Meg's original thought. And so what happens is, "Let us do the fighting when it's necessary," they told her. A delinquent. There's that line there, that dash, that M dash as it's called. It's used to interrupt that thought of Meg's and just add to it. And then when your father gets back, I wish father, but you don't usually use the word but in the beginning of a sentence unless you're trying to make a point. So there's that M dash after the end of that paragraph, and but is interrupting it. Anyway, let's continue. It's interesting. Gets back from where and when? Surely her mother must know what people were saying, must be aware of the smugly vicious gossip. Surely it must hurt her as it did Meg. But if it did, she gave no outward sign. Nothing ruffled the serenity of her expression. Why can't I hide it too? Meg thought. Why do I always have to show everything? The window rattled madly in the wind, and she pulled the quilt close about her. Curled up on one of her pillows, a gray fluff of kitten yawned, showing its pink tongue. Tucked its head under again, and went back to sleep. Everybody was asleep. Everybody except Meg. Even Charles Wallace, the dumb baby brother, who had an uncanny way of knowing when she was awake and unhappy, and who would come, so many nights, tiptoeing up the attic stairs to her. Even Charles Wallace was asleep. How could they sleep? All day on the radio there had been hurricane warnings. How could they leave her up in the attic in the rickety brass bed, knowing that the roof might be blown right off the house, and she tossed out into the wild night sky to land who knows where? Her shivering grew uncontrollable. You asked to have the attic bedroom, she told herself savagely. Mother let you have it because you're the oldest. It's a privilege, not a punishment. Not during a hurricane. It isn't a privilege, she said aloud. She tossed the quilt down on the foot of the bed and stood up. The kitten stretched luxuriously and looked up at her with huge innocent eyes. Go back to sleep, Meg said. Just be glad you're a kitten and not a monster like me. She looked at herself in the wardrobe mirror and made a horrible face, bearing a mouthful of teeth covered with braces. Automatically, she pushed her glasses into position, ran her fingers through her mouse-brown hair so that it stood wildly on end, and let out a sigh almost as noisy as the wind. The wide wooden floorboards were cold against her feet. Wind blew in the crevices about the window frame, in spite of the protection the storm sash was supposed to offer. She could hear wind howling in the chimneys. From all the way downstairs she could hear Front Brass, the big black dog, starting to bark. He must be frightened, too. What was he barking at? Front Brass never barked without reason. Suddenly she remembered that when she had gone to the post office to pick up the mail she'd heard about, a tramp who was supposed to have stolen 12 sheets from Mrs. Buncombe, the constable's wife. They hadn't caught him, and maybe he was heading for the Murray's house right now, isolated on a back road as it was. And this time, maybe he'd be after more than sheets. Meg hadn't paid much attention to the talk about the tramp at the time, because the postmistress, with a sugary smile, had asked if she'd heard from her father lately. She left her little room and made her way through the shadows of the main attic, bumping against the ping-pong table. Now I'll have a bruise on my hip on top of everything else, she thought. Next, she walked into her old doll's house. Charles Wallace's rocking horse, the twins' electric trains. Why must everything happen to me? She demanded of a large teddy bear. At the foot of the attic stairs, she stood still and listened. Not a sound from Charles Wallace's room on the right. On the left, in her parents' room, not a rustle from her mother sleeping alone in the great double bed. She tiptoed down the hall and into the twins' room, pushing again at her glasses, as though they could help her to see better in the dark. Denny's was snoring. Sandy murmured something about baseball and subsided. The twins didn't have any problems. They weren't great students, but they weren't bad ones either. They were perfectly content with a succession of B's and an occasional A or C. They're strong and fast runners and good at games. And when cracks were made about anybody in the Murray family, they weren't made about Sandy and Denny's. She left the twins' room and went on downstairs, avoiding the creaking seventh step. Fortinbras had stopped barking. It wasn't the tramp this time, then. Fort would go on barking if anybody was around. But suppose the tramp does come? Suppose he has a knife? Nobody lives near enough to hear if we screamed and screamed and screamed. Nobody'd care anyhow. I'll make myself some cocoa, she decided. That'll cheer me up, and if the roof blows off, at least I won't go off with it. In the kitchen, a light was already on, and Charles Wallace was sitting at the table drinking milk and eating bread and jam. He looked very small and vulnerable, sitting there alone in the big old-fashioned kitchen, a blond little boy in faded blue Miss Dr. Denton's, his feet swinging a good 6 inches above the floor. "Hi," he said cheerfully. "I've been waiting for you." From under the table where he was laying at Charles Wallace's feet, hoping from a crumb or two, Fortinbras raised his slender dark head in greeting to Meg, and his tail thumped against the floor. Fortinbras had arrived on their doorstep, a half-grown puppy, scrawny and abandoned, one winter night. He was, Meg's father had decided, part Leyland setter and part greyhound, and he had a slender, dark beauty that was all his own. "Why didn't you come up to the attic?" Meg asked her brother, speaking as though he were at least her own age. "I've been scared stiff." "Too windy up in that attic of yours," little boy said. "I knew you'd be down. I put some milk on the stove for you. It ought to be hot by now." How did Charles Wallace always know about her? How could he always tell? He never knew, or seemed to care, what Denny's or Sandy were thinking. It was his mother's mind, and Meg's that he probed with frightening accuracy. Was it because people were a little afraid of him that they whispered about the Murray's youngest child, who was rumored to be not quite bright? "I've heard that clever people often have subnormal children," Meg had at once overheard. "The 2 boys seem to be nice, regular children, but that unattractive girl and the baby boys certainly aren't all there." It was true that Charles Wallace seldom spoke when anybody was around, so that many people thought he'd never learned to talk. And it was true that he hadn't talked at all until he was about almost 4. Meg would turn white with fury when people looked at him and chuckled, and clucked, shaking their heads sadly. "Don't worry about Charles Wallace, Meg," her father had once told her. Meg remembered, and very clearly, because it was shortly before he went away. "There's nothing the matter with his mind. He just does things his own way, in his own time." "I don't want him to grow up to be dumb like me," Meg had said. "Oh, my darling, you're not dumb," her father answered. "You're like Charles Wallace. Your development has to go at its own pace. It just doesn't happen to be the usual pace." "How do you know?" Meg had demanded. "How do you know I'm not dumb? Isn't it just because you love me?" "I love you, but that's not what tells me. Mother and I have gotten you a number of tests, you know." Yes, that was true. Meg had realized that some of the games her parents played with her were tests of some kind, and there had been more for her and Charles Wallace than for the twins. "IQ tests, you mean?" "Yes, some of them." "Is my IQ okay?" "More than okay." "What is it?" "That I'm not going to tell you, but it assures me that both you and Charles Wallace will be able to do pretty much whatever you like when you grow up to yourselves. You just wait till Charles Wallace starts to talk. You'll see." How right he had been about that. Though he himself had left before Charles Wallace began to speak, suddenly, with none of the usual baby preliminaries, using entire sentences. How proud he would have been. "You'd better check the milk," Charles Wallace said to Meg now, his dictation clearer and clearer, clearer and cleaner than that of most 5-year-olds. "You know you don't like it when it gets a skin on top." "You put it in more than twice enough milk," Meg poured into the saucepan. Charles Wallace nodded serenely. I thought Mother might like some." "I might like what?" a voice said, and there was their mother standing in the doorway. "Cocoa," Charles Wallace said. "Would you like a liverwurst and cream cheese sandwich?" "I'll be happy to make you one." "That would be lovely," Mrs. Murray said, "but I can make it myself if you're busy." "No trouble at all." Charles Wallace slid down from his chair and trotted over to the refrigerator, his pajamaed feet patting softly, as a kitten's. "How about you, Meg?" he asked. "Sandwich?" Yes, please, she said, but not liverwurst. Do we have any tomatoes? Charles Wallace peered into the crisper. One. All right if I use it on Meg, Mother? To what better use could it be put? Mrs. Murray smiled. But not so loud, please, Charles. That is, unless you want the twins downstairs, too. Let's be exclusive, Charles Wallace said. That's my new word for the day. Impressive, isn't it? Prodigious. Prodigious, Mrs. Murray said. Meg, come, let me look at the bruise. Meg knelt at her mother's feet. The warmth and light of the kitchen had relaxed her so that her attic fears were gone. The cocoa steamed fragrantly in the saucepan. Geraniums bloomed on the window sills, and there was a bouquet of tiny yellow chrysanthemums in the center of the table. The curtains, red, with a blue and green geometrical pattern, were drawn and seemed to reflect their cheerfulness throughout the room. The furnace purred like a great sleepy animal. The lights glowed with steady radiance. Outside, alone in the dark, the wind still battered against the house. But the angry power that had frightened Meg while she was alone in the attic was subdued by the familiar comfort of the kitchen. Underneath Mrs. Murray's chair, Fortinbras let out a contented sigh. Mrs. Murray gently touched Meg's bruised cheek. Meg looked up at her mother, half in loving admiration, half in sullen resentment. It was not an advantage to have a mother who was a scientist and a beauty as well. Mrs. Murray's flaming red hair, creamy skin, and violet eyes with long dark lashes seemed even more spectacular in comparison with Meg's outrageous plainness. Meg's hair had been passable as long as she wore it tidily in braids. When she went into high school, it was cut, and now she and her mother struggled with putting it up. But one side would come out curly, and the other straight, so that she looked even plainer than before. You don't know the meaning of moderation, do you, my darling? Mrs. Murray said. A happy medium is something I wonder if you'll ever learn. That's a nasty bruise the Henderson boy gave you. By the way, shortly after you'd gone to bed, his mother called up to complain about how badly you'd hurt him. I told her that since he's a year older and at least 25 pounds heavier than you are, I thought I was the one who ought to be doing the complaining, but she seemed to think it was all your fault. I suppose that depends on how you look at it, Meg said. Usually, no matter what happens, people think it's my fault, even if I have nothing to do with it at all. But I'm sorry I tried to fight him. It's just been an awful week, and I'm full of bad feeling. Mrs. Murray stroked Meg's shaggy head. Do you know why? I hate being an oddball, Meg said. It's hard on Sandy and Denny's, too. I don't know if they're really like everybody else, or if they're just able to pretend they are. I try to pretend, but it isn't any help. You're much too straightforward to be able to pretend to be what you aren't, Mrs. Murray said. I'm sorry, Meglet. Maybe if Father were here, he could help you. But I don't think I can do anything till you've managed to plow through some more time. Then things will be easier for you. But that isn't much help right now, is it? Maybe if I weren't so repulsive-looking. Maybe if I'm pretty like you. Mother's not a bit pretty. She's beautiful, Charles Wallace announced, slicing liverwurst. Therefore, I bet she was awful at your age. How right you are, Mrs. Murray said. Just give yourself time, Meg. Lettuce on your sandwich, Mother? Charles Wallace asked. No, thanks. He cut the sandwich into sections, put it on a plate, and set it in front of his mother. Yours will be along just a minute, Meg. I think I'll talk to Mrs. Whatsit about you. Who is Mrs. Whatsit? Meg asked. I think I want to be exclusive about her for a while, Charles Wallace said. Onion salt? Yes, please. What's Mrs. Whatsit stand for? Mrs. Murray asked. That's her name, Charles Wallace announced. You know, the old shingled house back in the woods that the kids won't go near because they say it's haunted. That's where they live. They? Mrs. Whatsit and her two friends. I was out with Fortinbras a couple of days ago. You and the twins were at school, Meg. We like to walk in the woods, and suddenly he took off after a squirrel. And I took off after him, and we ended up by the haunted house. So I met them by accident, as you might say. But nobody lives there, Meg said. Mrs. Whatsit and her friends do. They're very enjoyable. Why didn't you tell me about it before? Mrs. Murray asked. You know you're not supposed to go off our property without permission, Charles. I know, Charles said. That's one reason I didn't tell you. I just rushed off after Fortinbras without thinking, and then I decided, well, I'd better save them for an emergency anyhow. A fresh gust of wind took the house and shook it, and suddenly the rain began to lash against the windows. I don't think I like this wind, Meg said nervously. We'll lose some shingles off the roof, that's certain. See how long it is. There's a few pages more. I'm not going to read the entire chapter. I'm just going to skip through a little bit to see. Yes, so there's some foreshadowing that I'd like to wrap up this video with. It's already getting to be 30 minutes. So there's this big storm, and just the whole atmosphere that the author is setting with it's like, who could stay asleep and something like that? And of course, someone would be caught outside when they shouldn't in a hurricane. And near the end of the chapter, there's a visit from Mrs. Whatsit. So Charles Wallace isn't just talking about Mrs. Whatsit. She ends up appearing. The chapter starts off with a hurricane. It's named Mrs. Whatsit. Charles talks about Mrs. Whatsit. Why wouldn't anyone, if someone is out there in that hurricane with it getting so violent, why wouldn't they stop at the closest house? And it makes sense that it would be Mrs. Whatsit, because things happen. Speaking of the devil, it's that phrase that happens so often in books like this, where a character is talking about another character, and that character shows up. And I'd also like to talk about the happy medium. In this book, there's a character, the happy medium. And Mrs. Murray talks about Meg's happy medium when it comes to her situations in life. So it's like every single character in this book has characteristics that Meg wants to have. And a great message of this book is that you be yourself and you find your own characteristics. You be the best you can be, and no one else. And that's pretty much what everybody in this book teaches Meg as she goes on this journey, not only to find her father, but also herself. So without further ado, if you liked that, please subscribe. It's fun talking about my favorite books. And yeah, Merry Christmas. Bye.